Let's start today's webinar with an acknowledgement of country. The Kids Research Institute Australia and the University of Sydney acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters of Australia. We specifically acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the first peoples of the lands on which our institutes stand. With attendees joining us from many different places, we extend this respect to all First Nations people, recognising their rich and enduring cultures and their ongoing connection to country. We pay our respects to elders past and present and honour their leadership as we work to reduce the harm caused by prenatal alcohol exposure. May I welcome to the stage Professor Elizabeth Elliott.
Thanks very much, Leah, and I too welcome everyone to the FASD Hub's webinar supporting adolescents with FASD tips for secondary educators. I want to particularly welcome our speakers, Julia Riches, Vanessa Spiller and Jessica Birch. My name is Elizabeth Elliott. I'm a Professor of Paediatrics at the University of Sydney, and I head up the New South Wales FASD Assessment Service held out of the Children's Hospital at Westmead. I'm also Chair of the FASD Hub Advisory Board. The FASD Hub was funded by the federal government back in 2016, and we aim to raise awareness of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and alcohol use in pregnancy and be a one-stop shop for evidence-based resources. The Hub aims to connect clinicians with researchers and policymakers and with individuals and families who are living with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We run educational webinars such as this. We provide a directory of FASD-informed services, and we act as a repository for Australian research and policy. Please do join our mailing list so you can be kept up to date with all things FASD. For this webinar, we're partnering with Learning with FASD to address the needs of adolescents with FASD at school, and you'll hear more about this resource later. So teachers are really on the front line when it comes to addressing the needs of adolescents with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And the purpose of today's event is to give you an insight into the lived experience of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in the classroom and to provide you with the knowledge, practical strategies and resources that will give you the confidence to support adolescents with FASD in school. Now, we know that longitudinal studies show that adolescents with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder who do not receive appropriate support have an increased risk of dropping out of school, of mental ill health, substance use and contact with the justice system. But FASD-informed teachers can partner effectively with parents to provide early and appropriate support to mitigate these adverse outcomes. Now, I'm just going to run through the running order and introduction of our speakers today. I will give a very brief overview of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in adolescents in Australia. We'll then hear firsthand from Jessica Birch some of the challenges faced by adolescents living with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Many of you will know Jessica. She is a committed national advocate and speaker living with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder who heads the company JB Talks FASD. Since her diagnosis, she's focused on building awareness to create a better understanding of the consequences of prenatal alcohol exposure and to arm individuals, families, carers, and health professionals with the information they need to create successful interventions and support. Jess has spoken about her experiences in a variety of settings, but until today has not really shared her experience of high school and adolescence. Jessica is a major contributor. She's a member of the FASD Hub Advisory Board. She consults to FAIR, the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education, and to the National Organisation for FASD, No FASD. And she's really in demand as a speaker in the media and at scientific conferences nationally and internationally. She successfully joined Australia's peak bodies in advocating for pregnancy warning labels on alcohol products, which you know have now been introduced in Australia. And she was the first individual living with FASD to speak at Australia's National Brain Injury Conference. Our next speaker is Vanessa Spiller. And Vanessa is going to give us her take on understanding and supporting young people with FASD. Vanessa is a highly skilled clinical psychologist, a FASD educator, and an author who's dedicated to raising awareness about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and other brain-based conditions. She has a training consultancy through which she empowers parents, carers, and professionals with practical tools and strategies to enable them to confidently support individuals with FASD and neurodevelopmental differences. She also has lived experience as a foster parent to a young adult with FASD, which brings expertise and empathy to her work. She's passionate about creating inclusive environments, and her mission is to make parenting children with FASD and other brain-based disorders more joyful by focusing on their strengths and building success so that children can thrive. We will then hear from Julia Riches, who will run through the new resources for secondary educators that are available on the Learning with FASD website. Julia is a senior researcher at the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use, which is based at the University of Sydney. And since 2020, she's been the project coordinator for Learning with FASD. This is an initiative funded by the Commonwealth Department of Health, Disability and Ageing to provide evidence-based resources on FASD for the education sector. Her research focuses on the translation and dissemination of high-quality evidence-based information on FASD to Australian educators and to the broader school community. And following all of this, we will have a 20-minute Q&A session. Next slide, please. So the estimated prevalence of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is actually much higher than we originally thought. We estimate it's probably about 3.6%, nearly 4 per 100 children. And that really means that in every classroom, we would expect one child with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Now, what do we know about adolescents specifically with FASD in Australia? Well, data from the Australian Paediatric Surveillance Unit from 2015 to 24 confirms that about 38% of nearly 1,400 confirmed cases reported by paediatricians were adolescents in the age range 10 to 15 years. Now, children in this age group are predominantly diagnosed with FASD in about year 7, age 12. There's an overrepresentation of boys, and very few of them, probably only about 1 in 10, have the characteristic facial features that have been associated with alcohol exposure. That doesn't surprise us. They all have the neurodevelopmental challenges that we're all aware of. These kids are located in all states and territories, but there's an overrepresentation of adolescents from remote and very remote communities, and an overrepresentation of children of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent. And very few of these children, probably about 60%, nearly 40% live in out-of-home care. Many have had contact with the child protection system. And importantly for teachers, I think many of them have an affected sibling with FASD. So as a teacher, what are the most frequently impaired neurodevelopmental domains you might expect to see? Well, perhaps not surprisingly, attention problems are very common. ADHD, either combined type, attention type, or hyperactivity. Often these children have problems with adaptive behaviour, living skills, social communication, and many of them have problems with executive functioning, planning and conducting complex tasks. We also know from our national data that the way in which children present varies according to their age. So as children get older, progress through adolescence, they're more likely to have impairments identified at presentation in executive function, in mood and behaviour disturbance, and in memory. And they're less likely, as they get older, to have a new diagnosis of ADHD. So I think in summary, adolescents with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder are very diverse. They're highly vulnerable, and it's important that they be assessed for their capacity for attention, adaptive function, executive function, mood and behavioural regulation, and memory. Multidisciplinary assessment is important because it identifies not only these needs, but the strengths of children. It informs not only their education, but their healthcare and the family supports that they require. And it gives them the opportunity to really fulfil their potential. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce a video recorded by Jessica Birch. Thanks, Jess.
Hi there, my name is Jessica and I was diagnosed with FASD with the sentinel facial features at the age of 33. And I experienced the entire education system unsupported, including tertiary study. Yes, I went to uni. However, the effort required and the impact of my undiagnosed FASD made me so mentally and physically ill that I only just made it before my nervous system totally collapsed. And I am still in recovery more than a decade later. My education at all stages has taken a very big toll, and honestly, I could talk about it from every aspect in detail for hours, but I have 5 minutes, so I'll do my best to give you a snapshot. My most painful childhood experiences happened in high school, and this period solidified the many negative ideas I'd held about myself. I was not just impacted by peer relationships and academia, but also my relationships and interactions with my teachers and how they perceived and treated me. I was absolutely miserable. I hated school. I dreaded going. It caused an immense amount of anxiety, stress, and shame, and I made every effort to hide it. There were many signs that I had learning difficulties, yet my underperformance at school was blamed on a lack of discipline, motivation, or intellect. Not a single educator, save one, ever inquired or offered assistance with regards to my learning or performance, and they absolutely should have. It would have completely changed my experience, my outcomes, my opportunities, and the trajectory of my adult life. Yes, absolutely. FASD presentations vary widely, so I think context about my FASD and the type of kid I was is important to understand the impact it had on me. I have significant issues with executive and adaptive functioning, emotional regulation, working memory, and attention. I struggle with cognitive load, verbal learning, retention, and recall. I struggle to maintain routines, but also get stuck in unhelpful cycles of behaviour. I don't adapt well to unexpected changes. I have disordered sleep, and I was an insomniac when I was in high school. As well as significant sensory and auditory processing issues, I have dysautonomia, significant and debilitating dysfunction of the nervous system. I have also struggled with anxiety and depression since childhood. I did not perform well in assessment, team projects, or physical activities. Despite all of this, I have strong expressive language and no intellectual disability. I am very good at masking most of the time. I was not disruptive, rebellious, or volatile in the classroom. I was quiet, somewhat inattentive and moody, but well-mannered and people-pleasing, with a strong desire to do well academically. I often started strong and capably, but could not maintain it, and my results would fall flat. That pattern is still present in my life today. My transition into high school was very socially difficult before it became academically difficult. I was desperate, absolutely desperate for the validation and acceptance of my peers, and I felt inherently stupid and unlikable. I gravitated towards children much younger or much older and became more and more fearful of engaging with peers as I grew. I started high school at 11 years old with 170 other kids, and I knew no one. I was totally alone. I still actively played with dolls and I watched cartoons when my peers had moved on. It was very difficult to integrate with groups of kids that had known each other since kindergarten. I spent my time on the periphery, looking in, sometimes included, often forgotten or left out of social activities. And at the many, many points during my high school experience, I did not have a peer group to sit with or engage. So I would hide in the toilets or the library so no one could see that I didn't have any friends. I was able to just hold on to my academic position in the top tier of students until I reached year 9. That's when self-directed learning, homework, essays and exams became part of the curriculum. And by the end of year 10, my marks had plummeted. Even though I had been a well-performing student, no one thought to ask why. At 15, I expressed to my advanced English teacher that I did indeed hope to go to university. Instead of offering a pathway, she laughed in my face. I was devastated. The impact of this on my sense of self and self-esteem was compounded because of the social group I engaged with. They were the smartest and the brightest, the school captains, the state representatives, the music proteges. They were the kids that graduated in the top 1 percentile. This was my point of comparison as a child. Ultimately, I consider myself to have been a smart, eager and social kid who retreated inwardly as feelings of rejection, anxiety, confusion, humiliation and shame grew. Naturally, I internalized it and I carried it into adulthood. Lack of recognition and educational support has caused immense harm in my life, and healing is an ongoing process. I speak publicly because I wish no child to experience the absolutely overwhelming sense of failure, despair and loneliness that I felt. Every child should be given the opportunity to reach their highest potential, and we need to be able to recognise and support students with FASD in our classrooms so they can. I hope sharing this window into my experience helps illustrate the importance of adopting this knowledge and resources. Thank you so much for listening and for the work that you do.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for sharing your personal and really very painful experiences of high school. These are stories that we really, as health and education professionals, really need to hear. I'd now like to welcome Vanessa Spiller. Vanessa, do come on stage. Welcome. Vanessa, what can you tell us from the perspective of a clinical psychologist about the challenges that are faced by young people with FASD at school and those supporting them, particularly as they transition initially, say, from primary school into secondary school?
Thank you, Liz, and thank you for welcoming me on here. I think from a psychological point of view, there's a whole range of things that are really important in that transition. Before I jump into those, though, I just want to acknowledge Jessica's story. And, you know, even watching it, and I know Jess, I've heard parts of her story before, and it's just heartbreaking to hear of her experience. I guess I'd also like to offer the alternative experience. And again, I do have lived experience of a young person, I have a young adult with FASD. And I think what contrasts so much about her story to my story, or his story, is the fact that, you know, his FASD was diagnosed and he went into high school with people knowing the diagnosis, and the school invited us in, and they were desperate to know about FASD and what that looked like. So they provided him with a really wonderful experience, and he loved school. And I think it just gives such a great example of what a difference it makes when we have that diagnosis and when that support is there. So in terms of some of these key things that happen in this transition between primary school and high school, well, one of the first things is that we have young people who are moving from what I would call a high scaffolded environment to a much lower scaffolded environment. And what I mean by that is that in primary school, you know, classes are very structured, they're very organised, you play in certain areas. There's a whole lot of rules that really guide young people through almost every lesson, every hour of the day. And one of the challenges when we go into high school is that scaffolding reduces enormously. And there's this really high expectation that young people are going to have the skills to manage that independence. From moving from class to class, to being able to structure their lunch times, to be able to structure their homework. And I think this is a really big demand. The next challenge is simply the amount of work. And again, I think Jess's point highlights this beautifully, that, you know, for some of our young people, they can mask and they can kind of keep up just enough during primary school and into those early years of high school. But once we're in high school, the amount of work increases enormously, and we can no longer just rely on things like memory. The complexity of the work gets higher, and it gets more what we call layered. So it's not just learning facts anymore. We've got to do something with those facts. And it gets more abstract. So again, we know lots of young people with FASD tend to be really literal or concrete thinkers. And when we start to get into abstract maths and abstract English, you can see that this really stretches them into a domain that they really struggle with. The other struggle is, of course, as Jess said, that identity and peer group relationships are they're one of the most important things that happen during high school and adolescence. And for so many of our young people who feel a bit different and they feel like they don't quite fit in, they're desperately looking for an identity. They're desperately trying to work out who they are. And unfortunately, if they get lots of negative input and they get, you know, people are highlighting their challenges, unfortunately, their identity will develop around that. And that's not what we want. We really want them to be developing identity around their strengths. And the last thing is that often we have this conflict because we have peers who quite often have, you know, they're developing some really good skills around various things. And these might be skills and abilities, again, that our young people with FASD just don't have yet. And maybe a good example of this is phones. So, you know, with many young people in this age group want phones. Many are starting to develop the skills to use these and use them safely. But lots of our kids with FASD, they simply don't have the skills to use them safely. So that can be really, really hard when your peers are pulling ahead of you, they're getting more freedoms, and you're perhaps not getting the same kind of freedoms, and you desperately want that.
Thanks, Vanessa. And what about that transition then between adolescence and adulthood? What are the challenges there for kids with FASD?
So even more challenges there. And this one, again, I think we see that shift from, and it says there a high scaffolded environment, but what I really mean is a higher scaffolded environment. So high school, even though it's less scaffolded than primary school, it's still got lots of structure and consistency and predictability and routine. So, you know, young people really know where they have to go and what they have to do. And when that's taken away, that is really hard. So many of these young adults with FASD will really struggle, particularly if they're not going into another structured environment. So if they're not moving into training and education, if they're not moving into employment, this is really, really challenging. And this is where things like SLES programs can be really helpful to help with that ongoing scaffolding. We also see that this is a time when skills in independent living and functioning are suddenly assumed by everybody. So these young people who we know have a range of impairments and things that they struggle with, as well as their strengths. But many people in the general community who don't know them often just assume that they are a typical 18, 19, 20-year-old, and that they are going to be able to make their own doctor's appointments, and they are going to be able to sign up for a mobile phone and sign a contract. And again, I think that really lets these young people down, because quite often they don't yet have those skills and abilities, and yet they often desperately want them, and they will mask and get themselves into trouble signing up for things that they're not really ready and they don't understand. The other, again, peers remain really important. And what we find here, again, school actually provides a really scaffolded environment for interacting with other young people. They're going to the same place every day with other young people who, even if they're not academically on the same par with, they might have the same interests in music or in sports. And when school ends, those scaffolded interactions disappear. And so lots of our young people will find themselves at a real loss, and they'll find themselves really quite isolated. And the last thing is, again, and this isn't true for every young person with FASD, but for many young people with FASD, particularly those who may have struggled academically and maybe who aren't going on to university or higher studies, and they're hoping to enter the workforce. Lots of people, most adults, get a whole lot of their identity and their purpose and meaning in life from work. And the same barriers that stop young people from succeeding in high school can really be enormous barriers to them moving into the workforce. So all of these things can be real challenges.
So Vanessa, you've outlined those challenges to us. What practical strategies can high school teachers implement to help students with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder?
There are so many things that teachers and schools can do. And I guess I've just managed to pluck out a few of these. So one of the first things is, particularly when these kids arrive at schools, they can come with so much complexity, and it can be really, really hard for teachers and schools to work out, where do we start? Where do we put our emphasis? So for me, we look at the way in which brains develop, and brains develop in a sequence. And at the bottom of that sequence, some of the most vital parts of that sequence are helping them develop skills in emotional regulation and executive functioning, which is our ability to inhibit our impulses, to link cause and effect, to develop some mental flexibility. So these two areas are really important because they're so important for regulation. And this is important because all learning requires regulation. And if you're a young person who's only regulated for this much of your school day, that's the amount of time you actually only have available for learning. So if we can expand their regulation window, we've expanded their ability to learn across the day. So for me, learning this skills in regulation and executive functioning increases their capacity to learn everything else. And it also makes them, they're much more likely to be able to develop really good and important peer relationships. Other practical strategies is that continue to provide and advocate for ongoing scaffolding. So particularly as their environments get more complex, it's really important that teachers and school staff are saying, look, this is because of their brain-based differences and their brain-based challenges. This scaffolding, this isn't babying them. This isn't helicopter teaching them. These are really the scaffolding that are needed for them to be successful. So we really want them to think about scaffolding across all areas of the school. So we might have young people who are in that 14, 15, but they still actually needed some scaffolded playground time. So that, I'd really like people to think about those things. And the last thing is that, again, we do see, behavioural symptoms. That is really common for young people with FASD. And one of the most important things that teachers can do is be able to get an understanding of the brain-based origins of these. So all behavioural symptoms have a purpose. They arise out of underlying brain-based strengths or weaknesses. And so if we can get a good understanding of those and what might be going on, and typically it's because the demands on them have outstripped the young person's abilities, then we need to think about how do we modify the environment? How do we change this so they can be more successful?
Thanks, Vanessa. I mean, as educators and as health professionals, we always try to focus on the strengths as well as the needs of young people, including with FASD. How might teachers best harness those strengths in the classroom and beyond?
Again, I think there's so many different ways that we can do this. And I think I've probably going to give you a very personal example of this. But as Jess was mentioning, young people want to be liked and they want to fit in. And so if you can find some ways of facilitating that for them by identifying their strengths and identifying the things that they're good at, and using these to curate learning, and also just helping them to build a big life around their strengths. They've got weaknesses. They know that they've got weaknesses. But we need people to actually focus on the things that they're good at and use creative ways to actually link that into their learning and their learning experience. The other thing, and this is, I guess, the really personal example, was, building on strengths and using these to facilitate learning and opportunities to lead. In my son's case, he did very poorly academically, and he was never going to leave school with any academic qualifications, despite him trying very, very hard. What he was good at, though, was he was very good at bikes and bike riding, but he was also very caring. And one of the highlights of his high school career was becoming a Year 12 buddy. And he just became the best buddy that you can imagine. And he just poured his heart and soul into being this buddy. And it was probably one of the first opportunities that anyone had given him to be a leader, and to be helpful to someone else. So, and, being a bit older, he was genuinely helpful to his buddy. And, he's now been out of school for maybe 5 or 6 years, and he's still in contact with his buddy, and his buddy's still in contact with him today. And that's because people built on his strengths and let him be a leader in circumstances where he really didn't get much chance to do that. And I think of someone like Jess, and what an amazing leader and leadership skills she had if that had been able to be tapped into.
Yes, I mean, Jess talked about the fact that everyone with FASD is different, and that her particular needs resulted in the emergence of really unique individual qualities. I think you've touched on that also with your son. Did you have any further questions on sort of harnessing those qualities in adolescence?
Yeah, I think this is one of the really important ways of understanding young people with FASD. So, it is a very complex presentation and really complex diagnosis. And if we look at the different diagnostic criteria, there's actually 84 different combinations of the ways in which FASD can present. So that's impossible. So, so there's no one profile of a person with FASD. So the more that we can understand a young person's brain-based strengths and weaknesses, and particularly those strengths, that will guide us into, what is this person going to be good at? What can we harness? What can we foster? And where might they need some assistance? But I think understanding their brain-based strengths is a great place to start, as well as their underlying weaknesses.
Thanks, Vanessa. Now we're going to move on to Julia soon. And remember, for those of you in the audience, you have a chance to ask questions, so please put those in the chat. Do you have any final words for us, Vanessa?
Yeah, look, my final words would be, again, as teachers, and I say this to parents and carers as well, skill development takes years and weeks and months. It's not something that happens quickly. So for young people, they can't skill develop tomorrow. But we can change the demands, and we can change our expectations, and we can change our environment today or tomorrow. So, really focusing on the things that we can change in the short term, I think is a great place for us to start.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. And now I'd like to welcome Julia Riches to the stage. Julia. And Julia is going to tell us about the Learning with FASD website. Thanks, Julia.
Tell you about the new resources that Learning with FASD has developed specifically for the secondary school sector. So Learning with FASD, as Liz briefly explained earlier, provides evidence-based information on FASD for primary and secondary school teaching and support staff. So what you can see on the screen here is our homepage on the left, and then the topic page for our secondary school resources on the right. So we developed and released these new secondary school resources last year. And I'm just going to take you through each of the new resources that we developed, including a quick rationale for why we chose these topics and what information the resources contain. However, before I speak about the individual resources, I just wanted to touch on some important information. So underpinning all the strategies suggested in our resources are what's called the 8 Magic Keys. So these were developed by Deb Evanson and Jan Latke, and they're guidelines or principles that are considered best practice in supporting young people with FASD. So the keys should always underpin approaches to working with students with FASD and be applied in conjunction with topic-specific strategies. So as you can see, these are things like repetition, routine, and so on. And these are linked out to in all of our resources, so you can read about them in more depth on the website. So the first 4 resources I want to highlight are fact sheets for secondary school teaching and support staff. So these are relatively brief, no more than a couple of pages, and they cover topics that are really important for adolescents with FASD. So each fact sheet provides an introductory section that explains the topic and why it's important, and also includes practical strategies that teaching and support staff can implement at school. For example, in our substance use fact sheet, it explores substance use in adolescents in general, and then why individuals with FASD are at an increased risk of harmful substance use. And then it provides educators with strategies to guide students against drug and alcohol-related harms. So these strategies have been written to be FASD informed. We also have fact sheets on mental health, social and emotional development, and transitions during adolescence. So each of these areas are a really important area for young people with FASD, and the fact sheets contain information about that specific area and then practical strategies that teaching and support staff can employ in the school environment. We also have 3 additional resources in different formats. So we have 2 short explainer videos because we know educators can be short on time and some people prefer different ways of learning. So one video covers an introduction to FASD in adolescence. As we've been saying, it's a really critical time for young people with FASD. And then one video on FASD and trauma, as trauma or the experience of traumatic events is extremely common among young people with FASD. And this can affect them in the school setting. And finally, we have a podcast episode that was recorded with Christine Brooks, who's on the board of the National Organisation for Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder in Australia, and is also a former primary school teacher and a caregiver to a young person with FASD. So Christine joined us to talk about challenging behaviours that may arise for adolescents with FASD and some helpful strategies for managing this.
So we're up to the Q&A now. Vanessa, perhaps we could start with you. We know as doctors and health professionals, when we assess children with neurodevelopmental problems, there's often so much information that comes out of those assessments that children are very complex. How do you communicate such a large amount of complex information to school teachers? I'm sure you've had some personal experience in this.
Absolutely. I've had lots of personal and but also in the work that I do now as a psychologist, I have these delightful young people who just have literally folders full of information. And it's really good information about assessments and the kind of suggestions for interventions. And they, a bit like me, take them along to the school and say, read this, you really need to read this to understand my child. And what I quickly discovered was, that no teacher has that many hours in the day. They are really under the pump and they're working really hard. So what I've been working on in probably for about the last 2 or 3 years is really, how do we get this information succinctly and accurately across to teachers? And one of the resources that I've developed is called the Ability Wheel. And it's a visual mapping tool that we can use to have a look at those brain-based domains that I was talking about, and to really provide a visual for teachers and anyone who's supporting these young people to understand visually very quickly where are their strengths, where are their weaknesses, and what does the environment demand? So we can then get a really quick sense of, okay, this is where the child is actually functioning in cognition. This is where they're functioning in social skills. This is where they're functioning in attention. And actually the school environment demands these amount of skills in those areas. So it really helps us to highlight where the child's abilities actually is versus their age, but also makes us think, okay, if there's a gap between those two things, we need to fill that with something. If we don't fill it with supports and accommodations, these young people, unfortunately, will often fill it with whatever they have. And these are often behavioural symptoms, things like aggression or absconding or yelling or what other people consider defiance. So using ability mapping really helps us, or the ability wheel really helps, I've found, to give us a real 1 or 2 page summary of young people and really hone in on, okay, where do we need these supports and accommodations? Everywhere, including in the classroom. And they also take their brain into the playground. So they need the same supports and accommodations in the playground. So that's how I do it. That's my preference.
So that's great. So we can put a link to some information about ability mapping and the training that Vanessa provides. You'll see on the left of your screen that there are some resources that you can download from the Learning with FASD site, the secondary school resources. The FASD Hub has e-learning modules which are available to teachers and others. And I've just been made aware that the Western Australian Department of Education also has a 4-part module for teachers, which is available free of charge. Now, there are a couple of questions in the chat. One of them, perhaps the first one I should answer, which is, how can schools help with FASD assessments while they're waiting to see a multidisciplinary team? What assessments can school counsellors and psychologists use? Now, what we'll do is we will put up a link to the new Australian guidelines for the assessment and diagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But this is a really important question, but because most child development units, most FASD assessment centres, most psychologists and paediatricians have very long waiting lists. So, for example, if you identify that a child has communication difficulties, a speech pathology assessment is very useful if you have a speech pathologist available at your school. If you have a school counsellor, they can assess the child's academic performance using a Wyatt or another similar tool. Some school psychologists will be able to do cognitive testing using a WISC, for example. So there are a whole range of assessments that are very valuable, both for you as teachers to understand that adolescents' needs, but also for when we see them in our diagnostic clinics, because it saves a huge amount of time if you've been able to initiate some of those assessments. Now, the next question I think is for you, Vanessa. It says, school psychologists are ideally placed to assess the domains of academic learning and cognition. In fact, that's a comment from you. Would you like to expand perhaps on what I've just said?
Yeah, look, again, I know schools have sort of limited resources, but in terms of looking at the brain domains, and particularly if we have these long waiting lists, school psychologists and some guidance officers too, they have the capacity, a part of what will be assessed if you were to go to a specialist clinic is the domains of cognition, and I know it's not called academic performance anymore, Liz, but that domain that looks at learning. So if you can have those assessments done within the school setting, those results can be taken across, even if you get them done at a clinic and you can say, look, I've got these results that were done recently, or if you go to another professional. So that gets those domains started to be looked at.
Great. Welcome, Jessica. Lovely to see you. Jess, are there any comments that you'd like to make?
I must admit, there's no comments from me, but I am available if anyone wants to ask any questions, and I can see there has been a request to share my video. Look, I don't mind the video being shared for educational purposes. It just, the things that I share are quite private, and it's just where they go, because normally I share within closed groups.
Thanks, Jess. There is a question here about many children in out-of-home care who inevitably don't have confirmation of prenatal alcohol exposure, but would otherwise meet diagnostic criteria. We can't validate the diagnosis, and I think that the important thing there is the important thing is the assessment and the identification of that child's strengths and needs, whether or not they have a diagnosis of FASD or really anything else. Would you like to comment on that, Vanessa?
Yeah, sorry, Liz, I've always got a comment, don't I, on everything. I think the other thing that was really helpful in the new diagnostic guidelines is the fact that there are some other DSM codes that can be used, and in particular that unspecified neurodevelopmental disorder. So FASD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, so is ADHD. And so neurodevelopmental, neuro being brain, developmental being across the lifespan. And so I think this is actually, again, even though it's not as well recognised as those other neurodevelopmental disorders, when it comes to the NDIS, you might have to argue a little more rigorously for them to know what it is, but it's going to cover the same domains, and it's going to allow you to demonstrate functional impairment, which is absolutely what the NDIS is after, as well as you have got a diagnosis. And the beauty of, I think, that over some of the other diagnoses is a bit like FASD. You know, the reason I always say make this your primary disability is because we get to count every one of those domains. So there's 9 domains within the diagnostic guidelines. So we get to count every single domain as an area of impairment, if there is indeed impairment. Versus if you go with, if you have a diagnosis of things like intellectual disability, what will the NDIS unfortunately will sometimes do is they'll focus on cognition and adaptive functioning, and they'll ignore those other domains, even though they're impacted. So that unspecified neurodevelopmental disorder, I think, is one of our really best options. And I think the more that we start to use that and provide evidence for it, I think that's going to be a really good option for our kids that we just can't get that prenatal alcohol exposure information for.
And on that, Vanessa, there's a question, does unspecified neurodevelopmental disorder get recognised by the NDIS?
Look, again, that's yet to be fully determined. But again, in theory, it absolutely should, because it is a diagnosis. It's not going to get automatic entry. So, you know, again, autism and FASD get that much more streamlined entry. But theoretically, as I said, it is a neurodevelopmental disorder. If you can demonstrate the severe impairment And we'll have to be really, and again, whoever's writing your report will need to be really clear about that. I can't see why it wouldn't.
Thanks, Vanessa. Now, Jess, there's a question for you, and it's about stigma. There's been a lot of discussion about the use of the name FASD and stigma. How do you think health professionals and teachers and others can avoid stigmatising people with this disorder?
I think I mean, look, I really do think it's a tricky one, and it's not a straightforward answer or a one size fits all. Had I in high school been recognised as a sort of a special needs student or a student needing extra support, I absolutely wouldn't have liked my peers to know that. That is very true. But would I have had an exceptionally better experience? Yes. So they're both true side by side. And I think for me personally, and, you know, the way that I sort of presented in my peer group, that would have been more helpful to remain private. And so it was something that would have been discussed in my, I think ideally, something that would have been discussed privately with my mother and I and the heads of the school and my teachers, and then maybe outside support given, and some support during assessment and things like that. So, and if I can, I'll just quickly share on that something that often gets missed with respect to my presentation is that I often failed in assessment, of course, because of memory and recall, but also because of my handwriting skills. So I have exceptionally good handwriting when I write exceptionally slowly. But as soon as I'm expected to work at speed and to write at speed, and there are some differences now, obviously having gone through high school without a computer, and now most kids type during assessment, I couldn't sort of perform in that way. So as far as stigma, yes, it's very present. Children don't want it. And I think that is how to sort of engage and get the best out of a student probably needs to be discussed with them and the parent, and hopefully that there in the future there can be ways to sort of minimize that stigma. And just lastly, I know that we're running out of time. I don't want to take up too much time, but I think in that respect, representation is really important. And I speak publicly to sort of to help with public representation and awareness building, so we can normalize the conversation of FASD with amongst the other neurodevelopmental sort of impairments and difficulties that can arise, that FASD is actually part of this conversation. And so normalizing and having secondary school teachers or educators more broadly, having our health professionals and others and community members actually be talking about this within the sort of parameters of their childhood development, I think is really important. And that is what is ultimately going to help minimize stigma overall and for our community.
Thanks, Jess. And that really important point is you can share the diagnosis or the origin of your challenges with those people who need to know or you want to know. It's very important for the school, on the other hand, to know what your capabilities are and what your needs for assistance are. So finally, I'd like to extend my thanks particularly to our three speakers, Vanessa, Julia, Jessica. This webinar was made possible due to the collaboration with Learning with FASD and also to the funding that we both received from the Department of Health, Disability and Ageing from the Drug and Alcohol Program. So thank you very much to the department for your ongoing support for all things fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. We've had over 380 registrants today. And our next webinar will be held in April. That will be a conversation with a renowned UK child psychiatrist, Dr. Raja Mukherjee. This webinar will be held on Tuesday, the 28th of April, and it will be a conversation with Raja about the coexisting diagnoses of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD and the approaches to management. So if you thought that FASD was complicated, it can be even more complicated when associated with multiple other diagnoses. You can find information about that upcoming webinar on the FASD Hub. So do take time to explore the Hub, join our newsletter, and on behalf of the FASD Hub and the Learning with FASD website, thank you again for your attendance. Thank you for your questions. We will look forward to them and look at them and try to answer them. And goodbye.